Howdy, it's Kyle with part 2 of the best rural areas in each state. I'll leave a link in the description to part 1 and also a little box up there. And I wanted to spend a little more time with each one. That's why I divided it up into 2 videos that are going to be each about 15 minutes. So what I'm looking at here is the best rural areas in each state. And the criteria that I'm using are areas that accurately reflect the surrounding culture, areas that are far enough away from larger urban centers to where they haven't been overly influenced from them, and also places that aren't overly touristed. And most of these areas have a town in there where it is going to be touristy, but as far as I know, none of these spots are touristy year-round and kind of ruined by just being a giant tourist trap. So let's take a look at part 2 of the best rural areas in each state. Starting off with Missouri, I'm picking the northeastern corner of the state. And some of these counties sit right along the Mississippi River, and once you get north of St. Louis, the river area gets really scenic. Hannibal is the most well-known town there. It is pretty touristy, but it is also pretty nice. And getting away from the river a little bit, you get to the town of Kirksville, which is a small college town. But just an overall nice tucked away corner of Missouri that, with the exception of Hannibal, a lot of people don't know about. Alright, Mississippi was not the easiest state in the country to find a really nice rural area. There are some decent small towns sprinkled throughout the state, but there really isn't one large area of multiple counties where it's all nice and rural. So I went with the counties near the Gulf Coast that are south of the city of Hattiesburg but north of the beach towns. The biggest town and probably the nicest town in this area is Wiggins, and even though you're pretty close to the beach, a lot of this area is dense pine woods. So it is nice to be really close to the beach and close to New Orleans, but not having to live right along the coast and face the biggest hurricane threat. Minnesota is another state where I'm going with a corner, this time the southeastern corner of the state. And this is another area right along the Mississippi River where you have some really nice scenery and some beautiful bluffs. The largest town in the area I think is pronounced Winona. I know canoes made there are pronounced Winona, but either way it's just a really nice little town. It's not the first thing you think of when you think of Minnesota, that's for sure. But just this whole area is really nice terrain and very wooded, and again the bluffs along the river are really nice. So just a really beautiful part of the state and somewhere that I don't think is very well known outside of Minnesota or the other nearby areas. For Michigan, I'm tempted to go with the Upper Peninsula, but I do think the northwestern part of the Lower Peninsula is the nicest part of rural Michigan. The biggest town in the region is Traverse City, which is another spot that gets a lot of tourists. But my favorite town in the region is Petoskey. And you might be thinking, wow, a lot of boats and boat slips. This must be areas for really rich people. But it isn't uncommon at all for just normal middle-class people in Michigan to have a big boat that in other parts of the country would be associated with rich people owning. For Massachusetts, I basically have to pick these two counties. Essentially, the entire rest of the state is either urban or suburban to Boston. But that works out well for Massachusetts because these rural areas are really nice. I think New England in general has the nicest looking small towns, and the ones around here are very nice looking. I didn't get to spend very much time here, but I could kind of get from the eyeball test that this is a really nice rural area. It's far enough away from any of the big cities of the Northeast to be directly influenced by it too much, but it's also pretty nice to have Boston less than 2 hours away. For Maryland, almost the entire central part of the state is urban or suburban, so the only truly rural parts of the state are the Panhandle and this area south of the DC-Baltimore metro. And even though you are still very close to DC, it has maintained its rural feel here. A good majority of the suburban growth in Maryland for DC has been north and northeast of the city, heading more into Baltimore. And also, when you get down this far into the state, you're not really near any bridge that goes over to Virginia or the eastern shore of Maryland, so it's almost like a cul-de-sac in the state. And as a result, it's really peaceful and quiet down there. I got my first chance to really explore Maine last year and really loved it. And as much as I love the interior parts, the mountainous parts of the state, those can be kind of rough, but I think the nicest part of rural Maine is the southeastern portion of the state along the coast. This is the portion of the state that people from Maine call down east, and it's generally the part of the state along the coast east of Bar Harbor and Acadia National Park. There's nothing very rural about Bah Harbor in the summertime, but once you get east of there, most tourists aren't going that far. So really nice and quiet, surprisingly very small towns along the coast here. Alright, Louisiana. This is the state that took me the longest to find a really nice rural area. So I'm going with this area in the south central part of the state. It's south of Lafayette and New Iberia and pretty close to the Gulf Coast. Kind of like Mississippi, there are a lot of individual little towns that are nice, but there isn't really a cluster of multiple parishes that are nice. Some of these small towns here like Abbeville or Franklin are really nice, but you really can't go anywhere in rural Louisiana without finding big pockets of poverty. Next up, Kentucky, another state where much of the rural areas have seen many economic problems through the years. But this part of the state that I'm highlighting here is pretty nice. You're kind of in the middle of a triangle between Cincinnati, Louisville, and Lexington. And because of that, you're starting to see a little bit of exurban development in this area, but nonetheless, it still remains very rural. So another example of a spot where you're in a very rural area, but you're close to big cities you can get to if you want to. For Kansas, I'm going with this east central-ish part of the state centered around the town of Emporia. This area is referred to as the Flint Hills. The Neosho River flows through here. I'm not choosing these counties because they are the most scenic in the state, but they are the most scenic in the state. So small towns like Burlington, Council Grove, and Cottonwood Falls are really nice. And Emporia isn't exactly huge, but I do think it's more of a medium-sized town as opposed to a small town. So if you want to see scenic Kansas and some nice small towns, check out the Flint Hills. For Iowa, the park that I'm choosing is directly adjacent to the park that I chose for Minnesota. This is the northeast corner of the state right along the Mississippi River, and some nice high bluffs on this stretch of the river as well. You have really nice towns like Decorah and Guttenberg, and just the drive along the river there is really nice. And I heard multiple people in different parts of Iowa say their favorite part of the state is this northeastern portion once you get north of Dubuque. So it's probably not the Iowa you were expecting, but it is very nice. Indiana, yet another state where I'm going with the northeast corner. Even though southern Indiana is more scenic, I think this part of the state is stronger economically. You've had some growth in Fort Wayne just south of here and South Bend just west of here. And like many other places I'm mentioning in these videos, it's often these rural areas that are between some of these larger cities but far enough away from them to not be exurban to them that end up on this list. And to keep the theme of Mississippi River bluffs in this video, for Illinois, I'm going with the northwestern corner of the state, right along the river. This is also part of the same driftless area as southeastern Minnesota and northeastern Iowa. And just overall, this driftless area is very nice, and the northwestern corner of Illinois is Joe Davis County. There's a really cute touristy town there called Galena, which reminds me a lot like Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. And then going down to Savannah and Mount Carroll, you're still in some really nice areas at the south end of the driftless area. Idaho is a state that has a lot of wilderness, but these videos are not about the amount of wilderness, it's about the rural areas where people actually live. So for Idaho, I'm going with the US Highway 93 corridor in the central part of the state. Mainly I'm talking about the towns of Salmon and Challis. There really isn't much else here besides these two towns, and it's far enough away from any interstate where it isn't getting a huge number of tourists. So I would think Idaho is a state where if you want to go rural, you want to go really rural, and this part of the state is really rural. I didn't even know where to begin when considering rural Hawaii. I really have no idea what would make a nice rural area for Hawaii, so what I did was look at spots that have fewer amounts of tourists. Of the 4 main islands, Kauai gets the fewest tourists. So with that being said, I'm going with the north shore of Kauai, which still has a lot of tourists, but nothing like Oahu or the Big Island. When talking about rural Hawaii, I guess just look for the fewest tourists. What do you know, Georgia, another state where I'm picking the northeast corner. This is the area north of the northernmost Atlanta exurbs into the highest elevations of the state. There are a lot of really nice small towns in this area, including Ellijay, Blue Ridge, Dahlonega, and Blairsville. You do have some towns in this area where a lot of folks from Atlanta have a vacation home, but it isn't that difficult to get away from some of the tourist areas and vacation homes and find some real rural Appalachian Georgia. For Florida, I'm going with one of the lesser known parts of the state. I'm not sure what you might call this area, the northeastern Gulf maybe? But either way, these are the areas north of the northernmost suburbs of the Tampa Bay area and west of the westernmost suburbs of the Orlando area. The main towns here are Inverness and Citrus Springs. You have nice beach towns, Hernando Beach and Crystal River. And even though there is a lot of population growth in this region, there wasn't a whole lot to begin with, so it isn't crowded yet. But I can see this area losing its rural charm through the years. But as of right now, it still is some legitimate rural Florida. Delaware only has 3 counties, only one of which is rural. But it's not even this entire county that I'm talking about, it's mostly the northern and the coastal parts of the county. So centered around the towns of Milford and Milton, and then heading over to the beach areas. The beach areas are of course going to be more expensive, they're going to have a lot more vacation homes and be more touristy. But even the beach towns have an off season, but again, once you get into Milford and Milton, it's really nice small town Delaware. Connecticut being a small state doesn't really have a lot of area that's rural. By default, I basically have to take the northwestern corner of the state and Litchfield County. And this borders the area for Massachusetts that I chose, and the towns there are just as nice, quiet, laid back, and scenic. There hasn't really been much growth in population in Connecticut, so these areas really aren't growing very much, so it still maintains its rural New Englandness. For Colorado, there are a lot of really nice rural areas to choose from, so I'm going with just about the dead center of the state. There's a lot going on in this part of the state. You have the US 50 corridor going through some really cool little towns like Montrose, Gunnison, and Salida. But this is also the part of the state where you have many of the high-end ski resorts, including Aspen, Snowmass, Crested Butte, and Breckenridge. But it's also the part of the state where South Park is. So you get that really good mix of Colorado here. You got the hippies, the skiers, the rednecks, and you put it all together and it makes for a great area in which to live. For California, I'm going with the eastern end of the state. This is the east side of the Sierra Nevada, Alpine, Mono, and Inyo counties. And this is deep rural California, not near any of the major urban centers. You do get a decent number of tourists at Mammoth Lakes and the ski resort during the winter, but other than that, the only other tourists are going to be kind of the road trippers going to Death Valley National Park. When I was in college, I remember doing some geology and geomorphology field studies in this area. So we'd be there for a week or so at a time and get to hang out in some of these small towns, and the people there are really chill. They don't like the LA folks, but they didn't mind us college nerds hanging out there. Arkansas, another state where some of the best rural areas are some of the prettiest areas. So here I'm going with the north central part of the state, Marion and Baxter counties. The main towns here are Mountain Home and Yellville, but you also have some nice big lakes in the area. And you're just far enough from the northwest Arkansas metro area, the Little Rock area, and the Branson, Missouri area. And about the only tourists you get in this part of the state are people from other parts of Arkansas or for folks doing the river trip along the Buffalo River. Kind of like Nevada, choosing a nice rural spot for Arizona can be difficult. Small towns out in the desert can be quite rough. So with that being said, I'm going with the southeasternmost portion of the state. This is a mountainous area right along the Mexican border. You have a couple of touristy towns there, Bisbee and Tombstone. And despite the kind of tourist trap nature of the town of Tombstone, there is some nice rural area around there for people to live. I can see Bisbee being the kind of place that can be pretty annoying during the tourist high seasons, but be really chill and a great place to live when the tourist off season is. Kind of like Hawaii, I don't really know where to start when considering rural Alaska. But I've always thought of the Kenai Peninsula being the most appealing part of the state for me. You get down to some of these towns like Homer and Seward, and they really don't get that cold compared to other parts of Alaska. They're small towns, well secluded, only served by an occasional cruise ship passing by. But there's just enough urbanness to these small towns to where you don't feel like you're completely left out in the middle of nowhere like you would in many parts of Alaska. And finally, for Alabama, I'm going with this north centralist part of the state. I'm looking at primarily Coleman and Winston counties. This is the area south of Huntsville and north of Birmingham. There aren't a whole lot of cute little towns in Alabama, but you do have a couple in this area. And just east and northeast of here is the tail end of the Appalachians. Coleman is too far from either Huntsville or Birmingham to be a spot where you daily commute from, but if you have a job there where you only have to go into the office maybe 2 days a week, an hour one way might be a reasonable commute. But either way, nice rural area with some nice scenery in northern Alabama. So that's part 2 of the best rural areas in each state, and every state has rural areas that are nicer than some of the others, so I did want to highlight some of these better spots. So if you're looking to get away from some of the hustle and bustle of big cities or even medium-sized cities, and suburbs are getting pretty crowded too, so these are really nice rural areas you can check out that are laid back, chill, really quiet, and great places to live. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up to let me know you approve, and subscribe to this channel if you're interested in learning more about geography. I'm a bit of a nerd, so everything comes from a more nerdy perspective. But yeah, thanks for watching. Geography King, signing out. I'd like to give a special thanks to my superior patrons, especially Cal, Kate, and Marley from San Francisco. From what I understand, Marley runs the household, but I figured I'd give them all three a shout out. If you're interested in supporting the channel or purchasing a pin for the viewer pin map, check out my Patreon page, link in the description. But as always, thank you for your support.